In less than 48 hours, everything changed at a dizzying pace. I want to be honest with you, even those who have been closely following this conflict could not fully grasp how fast it unfolded. Iran launched around 300 K-bar Shakan ballistic missiles. But the real point is not the number, it's the outcome. For the first time, a single wave of attacks was able to strike and paralyze the entire IDF Northern Command system, effectively disabling 5 combat-ready brigade formations. The command center that once coordinated Israel's entire northern defense architecture is now barely functioning. Command nodes were shattered, logistics disrupted, communications reduced to silence. And if we look at the reality head-on, this is one of the rare moments in decades where Israel is actively seeking a ceasefire not from a position of strength, not because of a tactical stalemate, but from a very clear state of vulnerability right on its most critical front. The way I see it, this is no longer just a tactical setback. It feels more like a strategic earthquake, a moment where the real limits of even the most advanced layered defense systems are exposed when faced with sustained, precise, high-intensity attacks. And more importantly, it creates a power vacuum rare, but extremely dangerous right in the Middle East. Washington is not without options. They can push more weapons, increase intelligence support, buy time. But to completely reverse the current situation, honestly, that's not easy. And if they go further, direct military involvement against Iran, the risks are obvious. Disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, regional bases becoming targets, and escalation spiraling out of control. These are scenarios U.S. policymakers clearly do not want to step into. And right at this moment, another player begins to step in with a completely different approach: China. Unlike the United States, China does not carry the baggage of recent direct military confrontation with Tehran. It has deep economic leverage, established diplomatic channels, especially after the Saudi-Iran reconciliation in 2023, and the ability to offer what Iran actually needs: pathways to ease sanctions pressure and long-term energy markets. If you zoom out a bit, the upcoming ceasefire negotiations will not simply be about stopping the fighting. They will decide who shapes the next phase of Middle Eastern order. And for the first time in modern history, there is a very real scenario. The United States is no longer at the center of the board, but forced to watch from the outside, while China gradually positions itself as the indispensable broker. The real game over influence, over power structures, and over the future map of the region is only just beginning. Right now, Washington is doing what it usually does in a moment like this, moving quickly, trying to stabilize things before they slip any further. Interceptors are being rushed in, intelligence support is being stepped up, and behind closed doors, the Pentagon and Tel Aviv are in constant contact. That support is real, and in the short term, it does make a difference. But if I'm being straight with you, none of that actually changes what's happening on the ground. The missile defense network, the U.S., helped Israel build over decades Iron Dome, David's Sling. Arrow was never meant to handle something like this: a coordinated wave of roughly 300 ballistic missiles hitting within a tight window. At that scale, it's no longer just about technology. It becomes a matter of physics. Each system has limits. Interceptors run out. Reloads take time. You simply can't engage everything at once. And that's exactly what we saw. Some missiles got through not just a few, but enough to cause real, lasting damage. So now the White House and the Pentagon are facing a reality they can't easily sidestep. They can keep sending weapons, keep funding support, help Israel absorb the Udar, but they're stopping short of the one move that would actually shift the strategic balance: direct strikes on Iran's missile infrastructure. Why? Because the risks are immediate, and they're massive. Iran isn't standing exposed. It has built its own deterrence layers, the ability to choke the Strait of Hormuz, to hit U.S. bases across the region, to bring Hezbollah in at scale. And once that door opens, it doesn't close neatly. A large-scale U.S. strike could spiral into exactly the kind of regional war no administration in Washington wants to be responsible for right now. So what you're left with is a very narrow lane. The U.S. can support from behind, but it can't step out front. It can manage the pressure, but it can't remove the vulnerability Israel is now facing in the north. And trust me, that limitation isn't going unnoticed. Especially in Beijing, that limitation creates space, and Beijing knows exactly how to use it. Unlike Washington, China does not carry the baggage of decades of direct military confrontation with Iran. There are no American-style sanctions wars or public threats of regime change hanging over the relationship. Instead, Beijing has spent years quietly building something far more useful: deep, practical ties rooted in oil, infrastructure, and cold-eyed mutual interest. Remember the 2023 deal where China brokered the surprise reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia? That wasn't luck. It was the result of patient diplomacy and the kind of economic leverage only Beijing can offer. Iran needs buyers for its oil and a way around Western financial pressure. China needs stable energy supplies and a foothold in the Gulf. The two sides understand each other's needs without the usual ideological lectures. Today, that gives China three quiet advantages Washington simply cannot match right now. First, credibility as a mediator. Tehran sees Beijing as a partner that delivers results without demanding political surrender. Second, economic carrots. China can expand oil purchases, invest in Iranian infrastructure, and open doors to markets that remain closed under American sanctions. Third, strategic distance. Because China has never bombed Iranian targets or imposed maximum pressure campaigns, it can talk to Iranian leaders in ways American diplomats currently cannot. In the coming ceasefire negotiations, these advantages matter enormously. Israel needs breathing room to rebuild its shattered northern defenses. Iran wants to lock in its gains without inviting a devastating counterstrike. Both sides are exhausted enough to talk, but neither trusts the United States to play honest broker. China, by contrast, can offer a face-saving package. A temporary freeze on major hostilities paired with economic incentives that make de-escalation feel like a win rather than a retreat. Beijing is not rushing in with grand declarations. It doesn't need to. The vacuum is already there, and the tools to fill it are already in Chinese hands. And that brings us to the next critical phase. This is where things start to get interesting, and honestly, a lot more complicated than it looks on the surface. What's coming next? The ceasefire talks over the next few days or weeks isn't just about stopping rockets or counting casualties. The way I see it, this is shaping up to be a real test of who actually has influence in what people keep calling the new Middle East. Israel needs this pause badly. Its northern command structure has taken a serious hit. 5 brigades are no longer functioning as cohesive units, and the IDF simply cannot afford another sustained barrage while it's still trying to rebuild command systems and restore logistics. If the fighting continues right now, there's a real risk this turns from a major setback into something much worse. On the other side, Iran also has reasons to slow things down, but on its own terms. What it just demonstrated wasn't just firepower, it was capability at a level that shifts the deterrence balance. If Tehran can lock that in through a negotiated pause without giving Israel the time it needs to fully recover, that's a strategic win. At the same time, Iran wants some form of assurance that the next round won't come back with overwhelming US-backed retaliation. And this is exactly where things get tricky for Washington. Because this kind of high-pressure, high-stakes negotiation is where traditional American mediation starts to run into limits. The U.S. is too closely aligned with Israel to be seen as neutral, but also too cautious about direct escalation with Iran to really push hard. So what you often get are statements that sound strong, but don't actually move the situation very far. China, meanwhile, is playing a different game. Beijing comes in with fewer visible attachments. It doesn't need to publicly prove loyalty to either side. Instead, it can offer something both parties quietly need right now, a way out that doesn't look like a loss. You can almost see what that kind of deal might look like: a temporary halt to large-scale strikes, some form of monitored de-escalation zones along the border, and maybe most importantly, expanded economic engagement with Iran. That gives Tehran breathing room, something tangible in exchange for stepping back. For Israel, a deal like that buys time to rebuild its northern defenses without having to openly admit how much damage was done. For Iran, it reinforces the message it just sent, while also easing economic pressure. And for China, it positions itself as the one actor that can still talk to everyone when Washington can't. What makes this even more interesting, at least from my perspective, is that Beijing doesn't actually need to force anything here. The pressure is already building on both sides. Exhaustion, damage, and the very recent memory of what 300 missiles can do, all of that, is doing part of the work already. China just needs to show up at the right moment, with the right mix of diplomacy and economic leverage. This isn't about goodwill. It's not about stepping in to help. This is what great power opportunism looks like when it's done carefully and done well. And whatever comes out of this, it's not going to stay contained at the Israel-Lebanon border. Now, if you pull back from the rubble in northern Israel and look further south, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Doha, across the Gulf, you start to see something quieter, but honestly just as important. A recalibration happening in real time. Those images of 5 Israeli brigades being knocked out of effective combat by a single Iranian missile wave didn't just stay near the Lebanese border. They traveled straight into boardrooms, into royal courts, into the strategic thinking of every Gulf state. For years, a lot of leaders in the Gulf operated on a working assumption that American-backed Israeli military strength, combined with their own advanced defenses and close ties to the West, would be enough to keep Iran contained. What just happened put a dent in that belief, a very visible one. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, they were all watching closely. They saw what is arguably the most advanced layered missile defense system money, and U.S. technology can build, get pushed to its limits by volume and precision. They saw how quickly the narrative shifted from control to ceasefire. And naturally, they're asking a different kind of question now. What do security guarantees actually mean when things get real? This isn't panic. These states are too experienced and frankly too well-resourced to panic. But it is a sharp reassessment, a more sober look at risk. For decades, the Gulf security model leaned heavily on the United States as the ultimate backstop, with Israel increasingly seen as a quiet partner in balancing Iran. What the last few days have done is expose the weak points in that setup. Washington can still provide weapons, intelligence, diplomatic cover that hasn't changed. But when it comes to direct, high-risk confrontation with Tehran, there's clear hesitation. And from their perspective, that hesitation matters, because the risks are obvious. Disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, attacks on bases hosting U.S. forces, a wider regional escalation that spirals fast. These aren't abstract scenarios, they're real costs, and Washington knows it. But here's the thing. In the Gulf, hesitation tends to translate into doubt. And doubt usually leads to one thing: diversification. This is where China quietly comes into the picture again. Beijing doesn't ask Gulf states to pick sides in a military or ideological sense. It offers something simpler, and right now, more attractive: stability through economics, energy deals, infrastructure, investment without the political pressure that usually comes with Western partnerships. And this isn't theoretical. The Saudi-Iran reconciliation in 2023, brokered by China, already showed that Beijing can talk to both sides and actually get results. That memory still carries weight. If you look at the priorities, Saudi Arabia is deep into Vision 2030 and needs stability to keep those projects moving. The UAE sees itself as a global trade and finance hub. Prolonged disruption is the last thing it wants. Qatar is balancing energy exports with careful diplomacy. Different strategies, but one shared need: predictability. And when missiles can reach Israeli command centers with that kind of effect, the old assumption that someone else will handle the hard part starts to feel less reliable. So what do? They adjust. You're likely going to see more look east momentum. More Chinese involvement in ports, rail, energy infrastructure, deeper energy ties which are already strong. Quiet interest in Chinese defense tech as a hedge, drones, surveillance systems, maybe more over time. None of this happens overnight, but the direction is already there, and moments like this tend to accelerate it. At the same time, Gulf states will want a bigger voice in whatever comes next. They don't want to sit on the sidelines while conflicts around them start threatening their own economic lifelines. Some will explore quieter channels with Tehran, often through intermediaries like Oman or even China, just to set boundaries and avoid miscalculation. Others will double down on regional coordination, maybe even push toward tighter integration in air and missile defense. None of this means they're walking away from the United States. That's not realistic. The U.S. still provides capabilities that no one else fully replaces, but the balance is shifting. What used to be a fairly simple formula, America for security, China for business, is becoming something more flexible, more conditional. The U.S. for hard power when necessary, China for economic stability and diplomatic room to maneuver when things get complicated. This isn't anti-American, it's just Gulf pragmatism, protecting wealth, sovereignty, and long-term growth in a world where relying on a single partner feels increasingly risky. You can already hear it in the private conversations from Riyadh to Dubai. Tougher questions, more hedging, less certainty, and China doesn't need to rush any of this. It just needs to keep offering what the Gulf wants most right now, a way to lower risk without slowing down ambition. What happened in northern Israel isn't just a local shock. It's forcing a broader rethink, especially in how the Gulf sees its own security architecture. And in that rethink, Beijing is starting to look like a more useful partner. Which brings us to the bigger picture. This one missile barrage did more than knock out Israeli command posts. In my view, it quietly altered the strategic map of the Middle East, and not just for the next few weeks or months, but possibly for the next 10 or 15 years. For a long time, the region operated under a hierarchy everyone understood, even if nobody always said it out loud. The United States sat at the top, backed by military alliances, advanced technology, and the assumption that when it really mattered, Washington could still shape the outcome. Israel was the sharp edge of that system, highly capable, technologically ahead, and for the most part unmatched in conventional military strength. Iran, meanwhile, was supposed to stay boxed in, pressured by sanctions, constrained by isolation, and kept under the shadow of superior Western and Israeli firepower. That framework shaped almost everything: oil, markets, defense spending, political alignments in the Gulf, even the way regional actors calculated risk. Now that framework is starting to fray in plain sight. What the last few days revealed was not just damage, but weakness at the structural level, and that is much harder to patch up quickly. Even the most advanced layered missile defense system built over years, with American funding, engineering, and refinement, showed that it could still be pushed past its limit if the attack was designed carefully enough. That, to me, is the real lesson here. Iran did not need to match the United States or Israel missile for missile, platform for platform. It took a different route. It built a large enough stock of accurate, maneuverable ballistic missiles, paired that with patient intelligence work, and aimed to exceed the defender's interception capacity. That is a very different kind of military math. And once that math works in practice, the deterrence equation changes for everyone watching. More than that, it sent another message, and this one will travel far beyond this conflict. A sanctioned country, cut off from much of the Western supply chain, still managed to develop and field serious high-end military capability through domestic adaptation, selective partnerships, and a long-term strategy. The capture and reverse engineering of the RQ-170 years ago was never just an isolated embarrassment for the United States. It was one visible piece of a much larger process. And I think that lesson is spreading now. The old assumption that advanced technology remains the uncontested monopoly of the West is becoming harder to defend. What Iran has shown is that persistence, adaptation, and asymmetry can wear down even expensive, high-tech defensive systems, especially if the attacker is willing to play the long game. For Washington, this marks something important. Not collapse, not disappearance, but a relative decline in its ability to shape the Middle East through military dominance alone. The U.S. can still project enormous power. That part is still true. But using that power against an Iran that is prepared, layered, and capable of retaliation now comes with a much higher political and strategic cost. That means future administrations in Washington are going to have to think much more carefully about where they draw red lines and what they are actually willing to enforce. The old pattern, maximum pressure, then limited diplomacy, then pressure again, is looking less convincing against an adversary that has learned how to absorb economic pain while steadily building hard power underneath it. China, meanwhile, may be the one walking away with the biggest strategic gain without firing a single shot. Beijing has positioned itself in a very different way. It can talk to Iran, it can talk to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, even Israel when needed. And it can do that while offering economic incentives that are real, not symbolic, without carrying the same burden of direct military entanglement that follows Washington everywhere in this region. That matters more now than it did before. The Saudi-Iran deal brokered by China in 2023 no longer looks like a diplomatic side note. It looks more like proof that Beijing can operate in this space in a way the US increasingly struggles to. And now, with Israel's northern defenses exposed and Washington showing reluctance to escalate directly, China has an opening, a rare one, to push deeper into the region's security architecture, not as a military hegemon, but as a diplomatic and economic stabilizer. And honestly, it may not even need to replace America militarily to gain real influence. It doesn't have to. In today's Middle East, influence is no longer measured only by bases, warplanes, and carrier groups. It also moves through energy agreements, infrastructure projects, trade routes, financial leverage, and one very important thing, the ability to speak to everyone when others no longer can. That is a game China knows how to play. Over time, Gulf states trying to hedge, Iranian leaders looking for sanctions relief, even Israeli officials quietly exploring indirect channels, all of them may find Beijing useful in ways they would not have considered so seriously before. What we may be watching now is the early shape of a more multipolar Middle East. Not a chaotic one driven purely by ideology or revolution, but something colder, more transactional, more calculated, a region where several powers compete at once through economics, technology, diplomacy, and selective security ties. Russia will study the tactical implications of this strike for its own military thinking. Smaller states and non-state actors will look closely at how Iran turns sanctions pressure into a laboratory for asymmetric innovation. Arms buyers far beyond the region from Asia to Africa will also draw their own conclusions about how Western systems perform under real saturation pressure compared with their alternatives. And that creates a long-term problem for the United States. Not the sudden loss of alliances, not some dramatic overnight collapse. The bigger danger is slower than that erosion. If China keeps showing that it can help de-escalate crises, protect economic interests, and stay connected to all sides, then Washington risks being seen not as the indispensable power, but simply as one major player among several. And once that perception starts taking hold, especially in Gulf capitals, it becomes very hard to reverse. At the same time, none of this means the emerging order will be safer by default. A more multipolar region can also mean more fragmented security arrangements, more complex bargaining, and more room for miscalculation when different powers start testing each other's limits. Stability, in that kind of environment, depends less on overwhelming dominance by one actor and more on restraint, balance, and a shared understanding of where the new red lines actually are. So yes, the strike on northern Israel was a tactical event. But its consequences are much bigger than the battlefield. It did not end the conflict. What it did do, in my view, was speed up the transition into a different kind of regional order, one where raw military force still matters, but no longer decides everything on its own. Economic leverage matters. Diplomatic flexibility matters. The ability to offer a credible off-ramp matters. And in that kind of emerging order, China is holding a stronger hand than many in Washington may want to admit. Which leaves us with one final question that deserves real attention. So where does all of this actually leave us? The dust hasn't even settled in northern Israel, and yet if you look closely, the ground has already shifted. What started as a military exchange is turning into something bigger, one of those rare moments where the old power structure in the Middle East gets tested and new arrangements start to edge their way in. And right in the middle of that moment, you find China. Beijing didn't fire a single missile. It didn't build the warheads. It just watched, took notes, and waited. And now, almost quietly, it finds itself in a position with the right connections, the right economic leverage, and maybe most important, the right timing to step into a role Washington is clearly struggling to play right now. A mediator that can talk to everyone without being seen as fully tied to anyone. I don't think this is about China suddenly replacing the United States in the Middle East. It's not that simple. What's happening is slower, but in some ways more durable. Beijing is positioning itself as the player you can't ignore in the next phase of diplomacy, the one that can help put together a deal where, at least on paper, everyone gets something they need. Israel buys time to rebuild its northern defenses. Iran locks in the deterrence message it just sent. The Gulf states get a bit more predictability, which, for them, is everything. And if China handles this moment carefully, it's not just about one ceasefire. It's about embedding itself deeper into how the region works economically, diplomatically, even indirectly on the security side. Energy deals, infrastructure, trade corridors, quiet understandings in the background over time, more of that could start carrying a Chinese signature. The Saudi-Iran deal back in 2023 was a signal. This feels more like an opportunity to expand on it. For the United States, this is the kind of moment that forces a more uncomfortable kind of honesty. American power is still there, no question. Military capability, technology, alliances, global reach, none of that disappears overnight. But power on its own isn't always enough anymore, especially when adversaries have learned how to work around it and even partners are starting to quietly hedge. So Washington has a choice to make. Adapt the playbook, move beyond the usual cycle of pressure, pause, and partial engagement, or risk seeing its influence thin out over time as others step in with tools that are, frankly, more flexible in situations like this. That said, none of this is guaranteed. China could misread the moment. It could push too hard, or run into its own economic limits. Israel and Iran could still slide into another round of escalation that reshapes everything again. The Gulf states might decide, in the end, that American hard power is still the backbone they can't replace. History is full of moments like this, windows that opened and then closed just as quickly. But right now, the window is open. The next few weeks are going to tell us a lot. Who actually sits at the table? What kind of deal takes shape? What each side is willing to trade, and what they refuse to give up. That's where we'll start to see whether this is just a temporary adjustment or the early phase of something much bigger. For now, the missiles have gone quiet. But the real contest, who sets the rules, who brokers the deals, who shapes the next decade of stability in this region, that part is just getting started. If you want to keep tracking how U.S. power is adapting, where China is gaining ground, and what all of this really means for the Middle East and beyond, stay with us here at U.S. Power Watch. And drop your thoughts below seriously. If you're seeing angles I missed, I want to hear them. Things are moving fast, and in a situation like this, clarity matters more than ever.